Well, can you hear me? Okay. Well, great. Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to see all of you. Given the weather here in Iowa, the predictable weather, you've demonstrated a great amount of personal courage to come out here today. And we're very, very grateful that you're here. We think that this morning is going to be a very special event for you. So I'd like to welcome you. My name is Dave Trotter. I am a panel member for the Bastion Institute, and the Institute is actually responsible for bringing this event together, inviting you, and one of the things that we do is that we focus on strong U.S. foreign policy as the Bastion Institute, and we facilitate a good, healthy discussion and debate about the challenges that we face today in foreign policy. And so a lot of times I get questions about how do you define foreign policy, specifically U.S. strong foreign policy. And I would tell you it's probably easier to actually talk about the implications of weak foreign policy. So I'll do that for just a second. And I'll let our guests talk about what strong foreign policy is. So some of the things that are interesting in terms of implications are that weak foreign policy can be characterized as that policy that is interesting in terms of the idea that it diminishes global influence for the United States, right? It can also destabilize alliances that are critical to us around the world and with different countries and partners. So something that's really important to me is that it can increase the risk of conflict in the world. I can also tell you that it can destabilize or decrease economic stability within the United States. So when you think about the factors and the implications of weak foreign policy, those are some of them. And it does affect national security. And it affects all of us. So the Bastion Institute is designed to bring people together to have discussions on foreign policy. And so today we have two very special guests. You know both of them. One, of course, is Nikki Haley, and the other is Senator Joni Ernst, our senator here in Iowa. So I would like to introduce Joni Ernst and bring her out here in a second, but just a couple things about what she's done and some of her accomplishments. First of all, as many of you know, she has served in uniform in the Iowa Army National Guard. She did so and attained the rank of lieutenant colonel, and she led soldiers into combat into Iraq, and that's a big deal. She has also served at almost every level of government, from local to state and of course, in the United States Senate. Two very important things, and she did both of those literally at the same time. A couple things that you may not know about her. She is the first woman to be elected to Congress from this state. Pretty significant first. Another first is that she's the first female combat veteran to serve in the United States Senate. Two very important achievements. And she did all those things simultaneously. But I think there's one other thing that really strikes me as important, as equally important as those things. And that is, she is a fantastic mother, right? She has a wonderful daughter. Her name is Libby, and she is a recent graduate from the United States Military Academy at West Point. Go Army, beat Navy, right? As an Army fan. And she is currently serving on active duty as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. So she has done so many remarkable things. We're very excited for her to come up and lead the discussion today with Ambassador Haley. So please join me in welcoming Senator Ernst to the stage.
Okay, are we on? We're on. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. We are going to have a great discussion. Thank you, Colonel Trotter, very much for engaging today and being here. We really appreciate it. Colonel Trotter serves on our board for the Bastion Institute. And so a little bit about our next guest. In 2010, Nikki Haley was elected the 116th governor of South Carolina. She was the youngest governor in the country and the first minority female governor in the United States of America. She is the only female governor in South Carolina's history. So another bunch of firsts for this fine female. During Governor Haley's tenure, South Carolina was a national leader in economic development. Known as the Beast of the Southeast, the state's unemployment rate hit a 15-year low, and it saw over $20 billion in new capital investment. And her administration announced new jobs in every county in the state. In 2013, her husband, Michael, a combat veteran, deployed to Afghanistan, making her the first governor in United States history to have their spouse deployed. The people of South Carolina decisively reelected Ambassador Haley in 2014, and 2 years later, Time magazine named her 100 most influential as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. In 2016, President Donald Trump nominated her as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, and in that role, she served as a member of the President's Cabinet and on the National Security Council. As ambassador, she ensured the American people saw value for their investment. She defended United States interests and kept our country safe. And of course, she championed human rights. And her work, of course, for her, the work at the UN, Forbes named her as one of the world's 100 most powerful women. So, folks, we are so pleased to have Ambassador Nikki Haley joining us today for this Bastion Institute event. Please welcome to the stage Ambassador Nikki Haley. Thank you so much, Ambassador. Welcome to the stage and welcome to the great state of Iowa, right? We've got some great Iowans in the audience today, and we're just very excited to have you here.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. First, I've got to tell you, y'all grow 'em strong here in Iowa. I mean, whether it's Joni Ernst, whether it's Kim Reynolds, or you look at the entire delegation, it is incredibly impressive what you have done in Iowa. But you've got a rock star in Joni Ernst. I mean, if we had every senator fight as hard as Joni, we'd be better off. So thank you for having me. It's great to be with all of you.
Well, great. We're going to go ahead and kick it off, and we want this to be just a free-flowing conversation, Ambassador. We've done some work before. I know when you kicked off your book tour, I was honored and privileged to be able to spend time with you and talking about some of your experiences. And so I would love, as we're talking about foreign policy, national security, you've been just a very strong advocate for the United States in those areas. You can share certainly with the audience your perspective on foreign policy issues. There's a lot that we're going to cover today, and the experiences that you've had with difficult situations, whether serving as governor of South Carolina or most certainly and most recently as our ambassador to the United Nations. So I'm going to start with the question about the United Nations. Because you did serve as our ambassador to the UN under the Trump administration, what is your assessment of the United Nations, and should the United States continue to engage with this organization, the United Nations?
Well, the United Nations, it's a farce. I mean, that's the first thing I'll say. You know, it was... It's funny because, every time the United Nations is not for the faint at heart. Every day it felt like I was putting on body armor because you knew you'd have a fight. You just didn't know which country you were fighting that day. But if you look at the United Nations, I purposely didn't study it too much. I wanted to go in with fresh eyes. I wanted to be able to go and ask for forgiveness. So what I did was I didn't learn the do's and don'ts of the UN. But I did go in with one concept. I wanted to make sure that every country knew what America was for and what we were against. I didn't care if they didn't like me, but I wanted them to respect America. And as we went in there, it was something that, I said, not realizing it was going to get so much attention, but I said, look, with the United States, if you've got our back, we're going to have the backs of our allies, but we're going to be taking names of our adversaries. And the United Nations, the concept of it, when it was originally formed, was good. If you put 193 countries in a room in the name of peace, good things would happen, right? The problem is all 193 countries don't share the same values. So they're never going to have the same priorities. And that's where we see the issue come to play. And, I can tell you that I said to my ambassador friends when I left, and I said to the Secretary General that if they really want the United Nations to be legitimate, they have to start talking about things that are uncomfortable to talk about. They still talk about old, archaic issues that are decades old that doesn't get us anywhere. They've yet to have a hearing on COVID and why China hasn't paid a price for COVID. They've yet to have a hearing on what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. They've had some where they've taken a vote, but they haven't called them out on how they've invaded into Ukraine. They don't call Iran out for enriching, and getting ready to have a bomb. They just refuse to talk about the things that are uncomfortable. So why do we stay? There's only really one reason that the United States stays, and that's because we get the veto. And so on the Security Council, only 5 countries get a veto, and that's U.S., France, UK, China, and Russia. If we got out, China and Russia would just have their way with everything. So we stop bad things. That's really what I found at the end of the day. It's the only real reason to stay. But we need to continue to use it strategically. We need to call out things when the UN refuses to do it. And I really did. I made them have the first hearing on human rights. They had never done that before. And we started calling things out that needed to be called out. And I think that if the US is going to be there, we need a loud bullhorn to really make sure that we're being tough on foreign policy.
Yeah, thank you. And you were that loud bullhorn. I do remember some of those situations. So thank you for doing that. You brought up the war in Ukraine, and I think many Iowans, as I move from county to county and river to river here in Iowa, a lot of people are very concerned about what's going on in Ukraine with Russia invading. But how do you view America's role in the conflict? Because there is so much information and disinformation out there. And what is your assessment of President Biden's administration's handling of this war?
A few things you have to look at is we wouldn't be in this position if President Obama would have done what he was supposed to when they invaded Crimea. If he would have dealt with it then, we would not have the situation now. Then you fast forward, and with the debacle in Afghanistan, it gave Putin the green light. I mean, think about it. For the U.S. to leave Bagram Air Force Base in the middle of the night without telling our allies who stood shoulder to shoulder with us for decades because we asked them to be there. Think about what that told our friends. More importantly, think about what it told our enemies. So then you go and you see Putin. Putin knew this was the weakest America would ever be, and if there was ever a time to move, it was now. Now, what should our stance be? The Ukrainians are fighting for freedom. This is not a war about Ukraine. This is a war about freedom, and it's one that we have to win. And the reason that we have to win it is because I don't think we need to put money in Ukraine. I don't think we need to put troops on the ground, but I think we need to get with our allies and make sure that they have the equipment they need. If you look at what the Ukrainian people have done, they immediately went to the front lines. People gave them 5 days. They immediately went to the front lines. The men dropped their wives and their children off. They went to the front lines. The women basically said, we're not going to do this alone. We're going to make Molotov cocktails. And they fought for their freedom. And they lost 27% of their land. Now they're down to 15. They're gaining ground back. But look at how...
Hang on.
So if you look at what Russia has done, basically... they're making their move because they know they can. But what Ukraine is doing is Russia has fallen so far. The fact that Putin's getting drones from Iran and getting missiles from North Korea, it's pretty bad. They've raised the draft age to 65. This past week, they're putting people on the front line and they're giving them shovels because they don't have the right equipment to fight. The reason that he's saying Ukraine's not an ally, but what I'll tell you is we had no better ally at the United Nations than Ukraine. There wasn't one thing we voted for that they weren't there. There wasn't one thing I fought that they weren't standing beside us. There wasn't any time that I had to ask Ukraine for anything. They were always there. But if we win this war, this will send a message to China. It'll send a message to Iran. It'll send a message to North Korea. It'll send a message to Russia. If we lose this war, we need to take dictators at their word. They said Poland and the Baltics are next, and you're looking at a world war. This isn't about starting war. This is about preventing war. We need to make sure we prevent a bigger war from happening. And I think it's a war we're going to win.
So, Ambassador, and I just want to share just this tidbit of information too from my own experience, and folks know that I do have ties to Ukraine and a very personal story with an agricultural exchange while they were part of the Soviet Union. But I will share as well that when I deployed as a company commander with our Iowa Army National Guardsmen, we were stationed at Camp Arif Jan, Kuwait. Half of the camp that I resided on was American soldiers. The other half of that camp was Ukrainian soldiers. So they were fighting alongside Americans during the war in Iraq, and I think a lot of folks don't realize that. So while they may not fit the typical definition of an ally, they most certainly have been there in many ways for the United States. So thank you for explaining that. So while we do have the war waging in Ukraine with Russia invading Ukraine, we also have other things on our mind. And I would say that the war in Ukraine is important, but I would also say that our most important or our most significant adversary is China. Mm-hmm. China is our pacing threat, folks. And so I think most of us in the room would agree with that. So how do we actually counter the CCP both abroad and here at home? Because we see the influence everywhere across the United States. And how do you view China's aggression when it comes to Taiwan?
China is absolutely our number one national security threat. And the first thing we need to do is stop being reactionary and start getting in front of it. You know, for too long, you had Republicans and Democrats who thought if we were nice to China, they would want to be like us. That's narcissistic. They don't want to be like us. They want to be communist China. We have to change the way that we treat them. So when you look at that, look at what China has done so far, and then let's figure out how to fix it. First of all, they have built up their military. They now have the largest naval fleet in the world. They have more air defense systems than we do, and they are modernizing. They have already increased what they said they're going to spend by 7.5% to continue to strengthen their military. Ours, by the way, our military is taking gender pronoun classes, just to say that. Secondly, they are going and they are stealing intellectual property, and no one is holding them to account. We just found out yesterday that they now have the 5th generation fighter jet, and they got it by stealing our technology. And we haven't done anything to hold them to account. Thirdly, they are basically over 1 million Muslim Uyghurs, making them change their name, change their religion, sexual abuse. We said never again would we look away from genocide. It is happening right now. And because everybody's too scared of China, nobody's doing anything about it. Then you look at their Belt and Road Initiative, which whenever you hear that, just think port projects. They're small port projects. They don't really mean anything. But they go give countries this money to do these little projects. And then they wait for a time like this when the country can't pay it. They run up their debt and they say, okay, you can't pay it. Give us your port. Give us your military installation. Give us your utility. Now, if you look at that map, it will send a chill up your spine. But the one that bothers me the most, Joni, is that President Xi started a commission that he personally chairs that says any company that does business in China has to cooperate with the Chinese military. Now, think about our tech companies. Think about all of your financial data. Think about all of your healthcare data. Think about all of your children's lifestyle data and know that the Chinese military has that. President Xi has said whoever owns the data rules the world. This is all about surveillance. This is all about capturing that. And we need to be smart on it. So how do we treat China? Look at it from a national security lens. I don't care if Americans buy T-shirts and light bulbs from China any more than I care if China buys agricultural products from our farmers. But when it comes to national security, we need to say if they were to pull the rug out from under us tomorrow, would we be ready? When COVID hit, everybody said put on a mask. And guess what? The masks were made in China. They told you to do the COVID test. The COVID tests were made in China. Go to the drugstore. All of those medicines coming from China. Are we okay with that? We're not. When it comes to those types of national security things, we should do that. Why are we okay with them owning 385,000 acres of U.S. soil? Most recently near Grand Forks Air Force Base, where our most sensitive drone technology is. What are we doing? We're going to sit there and let them do that? You haven't held them to account on COVID. But then, everybody talking about the cartels and the fentanyl? Where's that fentanyl coming from? China. They know exactly what they're doing when they send that fentanyl across the border. We need to start standing up to them and telling them what we expect of them and stop being reactionary. And did you ever think that Americans would look at the sky and see a Chinese spy balloon looking back at us? It was a national embarrassment. And they didn't just fly over South Carolina because they wanted to see our beaches. We're a military state. If we had flown a spy balloon over China, do you think they would have just said, oh, let it go? We have to get smart. We've got to get strategic. And when we do that, and I saw this at the United Nations, when you're strong with China, when you tell them what you expect of them, they do tend to get their backs up. And it's another reason why we need to win that war with Ukraine and Russia. China's watching what we do with Ukraine. They're watching who we've sanctioned. They're watching what other countries are joining us. If they see us stay true on Ukraine with our allies, they will hold off on Taiwan. That's the big issue of why this all matters. And we need to make sure that Taiwan is strong and Taiwan's ready, and that they know that if you're going to mess with Taiwan, you're going to deal with a whole other group of countries that aren't going to allow that to happen.
Absolutely. And Ambassador, I know we've had discussions about many other regions as well, and I was recently on a congressional delegation trip to the Middle East, and we visited with some of our top leaders in Israel. We visited with leaders in Saudi Arabia and in the United Arab Emirates. And a common theme that we have found, and as serving as the co-chair of the Abraham Accords caucus, what we have discovered is that many of those countries, what brings them together is the threat of Iran. And we know that Iran, you alluded to this just a bit ago, has reached over 80% nuclear enrichment. How do we prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon? And then how can we work with our partners all across the Middle East to counter Iran?
So going back to Iran when President Obama was there, basically they went and they gave planes full of cash to Iran thinking that, okay, maybe if we pay them off, that they will stop producing. But if you give Iran money, all they're going to do is spread their terrorist proxies. You know, whether it's the Houthis in Yemen, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, whether it's Hamas with Gaza, they will just continue to infiltrate. So when it came to the Iran deal, Congress rightly, when President Obama passed it without Congress's help, Congress put a bill in place that said every president would have to, every 90 days, decide if it was in the national security interest to still be in the Iran deal. So when President Trump came in, he had that idea of, okay, should we do this? And he was questioning it at the time. Everybody on our national security team was like, no, you got to stay in. You got to stay in. And so I went to him and I said, I would like to do some research. If you will let me go to Vienna, to where the International Atomic Energy Agency was, and let me ask them questions about how they monitored the deal, I will come back and make the case, rightly or wrongly, on whether we should stay in or out. So he said I could go. So I went to the IAEA and I said, okay, first of all, you know, I know you do inspections. We know a lot of the research is happening in the universities. How often do you inspect the universities? They said, we don't inspect the universities. I said, okay, well, we know a lot of the production is happening in the military installations. How often do you inspect the military installations? They said, we're not allowed to inspect the military installations. I said, okay, what is it that you inspect? They said, well, if we get a tip and we think something is going on, then we give them 45 days and then we go and we inspect. I came back and I told President Trump, I said, it is in our national security interest to get out of the Iran deal. I made the case. He went and decided to get out of the Iran deal. They have never told the truth about anything. And keep in mind, the Iranian regime, they say death to America every day. So no amount of money is going to change them from thinking that way. So now we're in a situation where they are producing and they're doing what we need to. The Iran deal was a deal with a bunch of Europeans. And that's fine. We appreciate our European brothers and sisters, but they don't need to be the ones talking about Iran. You need to deal with the countries in the Middle East. It's the Arab countries that do not want Iran to get a bomb. It's Israel that doesn't want Iran to get a bomb. So the first thing we need to do is deal with those Arab countries, deal with Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, deal with Qatar, and say, how do we keep Iran from doing that? When the Middle East is engaged in it, it's their neighborhood. That's when we'll really stop with, you know, what Iran's doing. But paying them off is not anything we should be doing.
No, absolutely not. I agree 100%. Iran, they'll never view the world the same way that we do. And they do continue to fund their proxies all across the Middle East, all around the world, whether it's Hezbollah, Hamas, you named it. So I appreciate that perspective. So I'm going to turn to trade, because we've got a lot of Iowa farmers and ranchers, businesses that do work and trade all around this world, and it's really important to us. Iowa is a top producer of corn, obviously, our eggs and pork, and we export to markets everywhere. The Biden administration has done very little when it comes to the trade front, and they're failing to create new market access for our farmers and our producers here in the heartland. And so how can we change that? And who are some of the key trade partners we should be engaging with?
The agricultural industry should be treated just like the manufacturing industry. You know, you'll always see government loves to sell the manufacturing industry, you know, whether it's cars or tires or planes or anything else. Agriculture is no different. So we should always look at all of our agricultural products and go and sell that too. And as the leader of a country, your job is, yes, number one, national security. The other is to market your country to the world and let them know what products we have. First of all, I think we need to make more things in America. I think that's hugely important. And then when we make things in America, we need to market it to our countries, but let's market it to our allies. Market it to India, market it to Japan, market it to Australia, market it to Israel. Those are all countries that we should be doing things with. And so I think when we do that, we'll tell them, look, we've got a lot to sell. Let's go ahead and do that.
Yeah, I think you struck a chord there. I think everybody agrees that we do need to make more here in the United States of America. And you had mentioned making sure, especially when it comes to national security, that we should really be pushing our own products, manufacturing domestically. And all of us here in the great state of Iowa know and understand that food security is national security. So we really appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, and I do want to go into this other topic while we're talking about that, because when we do sell American products and we want that to happen, when you talk about national security, you really need to look at who are our allies and who are our enemies, right? And how do we want to deal with that? And I'll give you an example. When I was at the United Nations, when we were moving our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the whole world was up in arms. They condemned us. I was proud to do the U.S. veto, but then we went in front of the 193 countries, and they condemned us there, and 128 voted against us. And I was so mad because I thought the U.S. can put our embassy anywhere we want. We always put it in the capital of a country. Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, and so we had every right to do that. So I went to our office, and I said, I want you to put a book together. And I said, the first column, I want to be all 193 countries. The second column, I want it to be the percentage of times they voted with the U.S. and against the U.S. And I want the third column to be how much foreign aid we give them. I took that book and I gave it to President Trump. And he, of course, lost his mind. He's flipping pages. He's yelling out countries. And I said, look, what I'm trying to tell you is we shouldn't give foreign aid just based on a percentage vote at the UN. But it should be one of the things we look at. We were, at that time, were giving $2 billion in military aid to Pakistan. They were harboring terrorists trying to kill our soldiers. We stopped giving that $2 billion. But let me tell you what has happened. Last year, the U.S. gave $46 billion in foreign aid. And do you want to know who it went to? Iraq, who's holding hands with Iran saying death to America. Pakistan, they started that money back with them. Zimbabwe, the most anti-American African country out there. Belarus, who's holding hands with Russia and has never been for the U.S. Communist Cuba, which we said was a state sponsor of terrorism. We're giving money to China. We need to stop giving money to countries that hate America. You can't buy friends. And how weak does it look that we're just giving money to pay off our enemies? Stop it. We don't need to be doing that.
God bless you. Okay. The ambassador, the Biden Department of Energy, as we're talking about China, COVID, etc. You brought this up earlier. The Department of Energy recently joined the FBI in agreement that COVID-19, the pandemic, likely, can't say for certain because Chinese won't let us in, but that it likely originated from a leak at China's Wuhan Institute of Virology. How can the U.S. actually hold China accountable for unleashing the virus that created this global pandemic and killed over 7 million people worldwide?
The thing is, this is not just about the U.S. The entire world is upset about what happened with COVID. This is something that we should make a global conversation of calling out China. But think about what China did. So I personally think that it came out of a lab. I think that I don't think they were being malicious. I think it was an accident. But I think once it got out, look at how they handled it. Did they tell the world? No. Instead, they closed their borders so that no one could come into China, and they opened their borders so that the Chinese could go out so they wouldn't be the only country embarrassed by it. Then they went to the World Health Organization and had them condemn the U.S. for closing our borders. So that's the country you're dealing with when you think about that. So first of all, I think that they do need to be held accountable. I think we do need to acknowledge facts. And I think we need to go and look at the damages, the financial damages that happen, the life loss that happen, and every country in the world needs to go and hold them accountable. And they've yet to do that. And the U.S. should be leading the charge on that.
Yes, this is where American leadership really comes into play. We need to push that. I believe in strong American leadership, and right now we don't have the push from the administration to hold China accountable for so many different issues.
When I was at the United Nations, what I saw and what we need to remember is when the U.S. speaks, the world listens. When we act, the world follows. Who we are, the world wants to be. It doesn't have to be troops on the ground. It doesn't have to be money. Just saying things as America is leadership. But if you're not even willing to call out a country that killed so many people around the world, then where's the leadership? Other countries are waiting to condemn too, but they want to see us do it first.
Under the Biden administration, this is a great topic because, again, I hear this from so many folks across the state of Iowa. Very important issue to us. Under the Biden administration, the southern border has turned into a national security and humanitarian crisis. I've been working in the Senate to crack down on the cartels. You just talked about the epidemic of fentanyl. We need to see that the flow of fentanyl and human trafficking is stopped. What are the 3 steps you believe we could take today and not only secure the border, but also address the fentanyl crisis that is not only killing Americans along the border, but killing our men, women, and children right here in our home communities in Iowa?
We absolutely have to secure the border and build a wall. That really is. We have to build a wall. The second thing is we need to go back to a remain in Mexico policy. We need to stop catch and release. When it comes to the cartels, the Mexican president yesterday said, we don't want the U.S. to do anything. Well, you know what you tell the Mexican president? Either you do it or we do it. But we are not going to let all of this lawlessness continue to happen. And we can do that by putting special ops in there, by doing cyber, by really being strategic. Just like we dealt with ISIS, you do the same thing with the cartels. But I think that what we have to look at also is, what are we going to do to stop the flow? We should do around the country what I did in South Carolina. We passed a mandatory E-Verify immigration law that said no business can hire anyone that's in this country illegally. When you do that, when we did that in South Carolina, they stopped coming to South Carolina because there was no jobs for them. That's what we need to do, is completely shut it off. But another thing is when Trump had the big immigration border problem, when he was, you remember he had a big issue with the border earlier. When he was putting, and rightfully so, remain in Mexico and stopping catch and release, I was on the ground in Honduras and Guatemala, where a lot of that influx was happening. And what we saw was the reason people were leaving were because of gangs, drugs, and trafficking. So we went to them and said, okay, what issues do you have? They needed help with how to combat the gangs. We sent our military over and trained them on how to manage their gangs themselves. We put drug boats on the water so that the drugs wouldn't go through. And through all of that, we said, look, we will do this to aid you, but you have to have people process from here. That's what stopped that flow, was because they understood, look, we're not going to help you if you don't help us. You have to do that. And we have to start looking at these countries where the people are coming from and say, you've got to do something about keeping them from even leaving your country in the first place.
And Ambassador, there was an incident just in this last week or so where we saw some Americans that were taken by the cartel. And there was a connection there. If you would maybe talk about the 4 individuals and where they came from.
They were South Carolinians. They were from my home state. And, for them just to drive through and them think that it was an opposing cartel trying to, like that. And what did the Mexican government do? Nothing. They were like, oh, well, we captured 1 or 2 of them. But that's not dealing with the fact that this is not only dangerous across the border, but it's dangerous here in our country too. We don't want those cartels here, and they are coming to every state in the country. And so if we don't stop them, this is only going to get worse. And every state is a border state now. And not only that, all of this influx, it's going into our schools. It's going into our hospitals. $20 billion was paid for welfare for illegal immigrants. Why would we do that? And we're not vetting any of them. And over 100 terrorists that we know of have already come. Iranians are saying the easiest way to come into America is through the southern border. Are we going to wait for another 9/11? Are we going to go and stop the influx now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I had the opportunity. Yes, thank you. Go ahead. I had the opportunity to lead a congressional delegation to the southern border a few weeks ago, and I have been to the Texas border a number of times. This particular trip took me to California. And I went to the port of entry at San Diego, and I had Congressman Randy Feenstra with me, as well as Congresswoman Marionette Miller Meeks. And we went to the border. Darrell Issa of California, another congressman who's on the Intel committee, he had asked me to join him there because he really wanted to highlight what was going on in California. And we don't often, when we think of the southern border, we do think of Texas a lot. It's got a very large border. But in California, at the port of entry located at San Diego, it's actually, that is the world's largest land port. The world's largest land port. 70,000 vehicles every single day coming across the border in San Diego, as well as 20,000 pedestrians every single day. That port of entry is described as the epicenter of the fentanyl epidemic. That is where we see the most fentanyl coming into the United States, is through California. And so we have an opportunity to make sure that cars are screened, people are screened, that we give the resources to Customs and Border Protection, as well as our Border Patrol. And yet they feel very helpless. And I know you have probably heard this, Ambassador, from our Border Patrol agents all along our southern border.
Well, we need to have the backs of our Border Patrol, but let's talk about fentanyl for a minute. So, obviously, we had enough come across the border that could kill every American. But I also want people to understand that those that are dying from fentanyl, don't assume these are druggies. Don't assume that these are people addicted to things. These are kids that might just be taking an ADD pill because they've got a test, and so they're like, oh, I need to focus. Do you have one? And you know how they share those pills? That's what it is. So this could be a student one time that takes a pill that's got just the littlest bit of fentanyl, and it'll kill them. That's why this is so important that every parent understand that, yes, we have to start having these conversations with our kids that don't take anything from anybody, regardless of what they say. But this is not for like people shooting up needles. This is from something that they can put it on anything. And then now you see they're making it look like, Skittles and Nerds and things like that, so that our little ones think that they're being given candy and dying from it. It's very, very serious.
It is extremely serious. And the Drug Enforcement Agency as well, when they briefed our group, they talked about how they are getting this poison from China into Mexico, and then from Mexico distributed throughout the United States. A lot of it is done on social media platforms like Snapchat, where they will advertise for these pills. And as you are absolutely correct, many of our young people will think, well, I'm just ordering an Adderall. and they'll order a pill, and the DEA agent said they're disguised. You know, they will run them up into the United States from Mexico, but oftentimes it's just ibuprofen that has been mixed with fentanyl. It's not Adderall at all. But again, the social media platforms, and we're working on that in the United States Senate, but the poisoning of our communities, whether it's from China or through Mexico, is a national security issue and one that we need to dive into. So thank you. The mission, again, today of the Bastion Institute is to help the American people, just like all of the folks that we have in this room and those that are viewing today, understand why American leadership and engagement at home and abroad matters in their daily lives. In the time that we do have left, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the importance of American leadership.
Look, I think that America right now looks so distracted. And when America's distracted, the world is less safe. And the world, if we want the world to be at peace, America has to be strong. And the first thing we need to do is strengthen our military. Make sure that we have the best military in the world. They don't need to be taking gender pronoun classes. They need to make sure they're being innovative, technology, all of those things. Because a strong military doesn't start wars, a strong military prevents wars, and that's what we need to focus on. The second thing is we need to start looking at everything through the lens of national security. Remember that government was intended to secure the rights and freedoms of the people. It was never intended to be all things to all people. We should only be focused on national security. If it's a threat to the safety of Americans, that's where our focus should be. And before, you always saw national security was, okay, how are we by land, by air, by sea? Well, yes, let's make sure we're at the top of our game, land, air, sea, but we also need to be looking at cyber. We also need to be looking at artificial intelligence. We have to look at the next generational types of ways to protect ourselves, because the next war isn't necessarily going to be land, air, or sea. It very much could be someone hacking into our utilities, someone, destabilizing America through other ways. Now we're dealing with satellites that could do the same thing. And so when you think of American leadership, we think of that. But I'll tell you, the biggest threat to America is this national self-loathing that we have. The idea that people are saying America's bad or rotten or racist. We have to go back to loving America again. I want our kids to love America. I'm the daughter of immigrant parents. They came here 50 years ago. When they came, our country was strong. Our country was full of opportunities. We were growing. We need to go back to that. I'm the wife of a combat veteran who served in Afghanistan. We need to let our military men and women know their sacrifices and their family sacrifices matter. That we believe in that freedom the same much as anything else. And as a mom, I have 2 children. I want our children to know their best days are ahead of them. And the only way we do that is by having a strong and proud America again. That's why I think we need new generational leadership. That's why I think we need to start looking in a different direction, is stop the drama and the status quo of the past. Now let's get focused on what is really threatening America. I don't want anyone to worry about their national security. If you have a president that's strong and leads, Americans don't have to worry, and you shouldn't. We should go back to the America like when you grew up, when your neighborhoods were safe, when all you dealt with, it was faith, family, and country. That's the America we need to go back to. When we get back to that, that is a strong America. That is leading.
Thank you so much. Well, Ambassador, I really do appreciate your expertise and your focus on American leadership, and I appreciate your service absolutely as governor to the great state of South Carolina. We all know and love our governor, Kim Reynolds, here in the state of Iowa.
Best governor in the country, hands
love
down.
her. And so So we appreciate the strong executive leadership that you brought to your great state of South Carolina, but as well the fact that you are standing strong for America, for American values at the United Nations as well. And I certainly appreciate how you think we should interact globally and project ourselves as a strong nation. And it does matter. And again, the Bastion Institute is very focused on projecting strength, American leadership, and how we shouldn't be cowering to the Irans, to the Chinas and the Russias of the world. We have the most incredible nation on the face of the planet, and we should certainly project ourselves as such. So God bless you for engaging in this discussion today. We look forward to hearing more from you in the weeks and the months to come. But everyone, let's thank Ambassador Haley for her wonderful participation today.
Thank you very much. God bless you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. Thank you.